Hello and welcome to the third lesson in our course, Social Psychology. So I want to start this lesson by asking you how you feel about the following issues. The martial law during Ferdinand Marcos's regime. How do you feel about the ICC's investigation on Duterte's drug war? Or how do you feel about same-sex marriage? I also want to ask you, how do you feel about Tony Gonzaga's interview with Bongbong Marcos? Now, regardless of your answers in this divisive issues, I'm actually asking you about or a question regarding your attitudes on the following issues. Now, in psychology, when we say attitudes, we mean favorable or unfavorable evaluations. In the context of my question earlier, when I asked you about your attitudes, it's whether or not you like the martial law during Marcos's regime, or you like the fact that ICC will be investigating Duterte's drug war, or you like the fact that or you like same-sex marriage, or whether or not you like how or why Tony Gonzaga interviewed Bongbong Marcos. Now, it should not be confused with what we call as behaviors. In psychology, when we say behaviors, these are actions and mannerisms made by individuals. To put in context, when we say attitudes in Tagalog, we mean saloobin. And when we say behaviors, we mean ugali. So it goes to show that behaviors are observable, ugali are observable in Filipino, while saloobin or attitudes are not directly observable. Now, conventional wisdom goes that attitudes predict behavior. But if you have been following our lessons, you will come to realize that we don't just accept conventional wisdoms. As psychology students, we challenge them. So, for today's video, we are going to talk about attitudes and behaviors. We are going to start by discussing how well does attitude predicts behaviors, and what are the instances where attitudes predict behavior. And then we are going to look at the other side of the coin and talk about when does behaviors predict attitude and why does behavior affect attitude. So, this is the ABC model of attitudes. And it structures attitudes in terms of three components. You have the affective component, and this involves a person's feelings or emotions about the attitude behavior. Consider, for example, when we talk about, let's say, the government's COVID-19 response, the affective component of my attitude would be I don't like how the government is handling the COVID-19 pandemic. And then you have the behavioral component. Sometimes this is called the conative component, and it's the way the attitude we have influence the way we act or behave. For example, we are still in the example of my attitude towards the government's COVID response. I will air my criticism about the government's response in handling pandemic through memes and Facebook posts. Now, the third component is the cognitive component, and this involves a person's belief and knowledge about an attitude object. For example, I believe there are better ways to handle the COVID-19 pandemic as seen in other countries like Thailand, Vietnam, Singapore, and other countries who are successful in handling the virus. Now, one of the underlying assumptions about the link between attitudes and behaviors is that of consistency. This means that we often or usually expect the behaviors of a person to be consistent with the attitudes that they hold. This is called principle of consistency. Now, the principle of consistency reflects the idea that people are rational and attempt to behave rationally, actually at all times, and that a person's behavior should be consistent with their attitude or attitudes. While this principle may be a sound one, it's clear that people don't always follow it. Sometimes, behaving is seemingly quite illogical in quite illogical ways. For example, smoking cigarette and knowing that smoking causes lung cancer and heart diseases. So this is evidence that the cognitive and affective components of behaviors do not always match the behavior. This is shown in a study by Lapierre in 1934, and we will be talking about that more when we go into the topic of how well does attitude predict behavior. So, Alan Wicker in 1969 found students' attitude towards cheating bore little relation to their likelihood to cheat. Attitudes towards the church were only moderately linked to attendance, and self-described racial attitudes provide little clue to behaviors in actual situations. In another experiment, Batson and his colleagues asked a group of people to choose from one or two different activities. Now, neither activity is entirely specified, but one comes with a reward. The participants are told that while performing this activity, they have a chance to earn raffle tickets for a reward. The other activity is described as boring and gives them no chance to earn rewards of any kind. Now, the participants get to pick a task, and they are told that they can assign whichever task they don't pick in another participant or to another participant. Now, the second participant does not actually exist, and therefore cannot be disappointed with their lot. But research subjects don't. But the research subjects don't actually know this. So, not surprisingly, when they're given a free choice, 8 out of 10 subjects give themselves the raffle ticket task. In subsequent experiments, the participants get a sheet of instructions detailing each task and gently suggesting that flipping a coin would be the fairest way to decide whether they get the rewarding task or the other participant does. Get this, only half of them do flip the coin. So half just decided that they want the rewarding task. Now, the non-flippers stay at the standard rate of selfishness, between 80 and 90% of the assigned themselves a better task. Oddly enough, the same goes for the people who do flip the coin. The coin is fair. How about the people? Well, not so much. Between 90 and 95% of the flippers, those who actually flip the coin, assign the task to themselves. So, what does this say? We're less attentive to our own moral failures. Like a rubber band that can be stretched only so far before it breaks, most of us violate our moral codes, only to a limited degree. So this allows us to continue in believing our moral self, or that we are moral. If we sin too dramatically, it would shatter this cherished belief. Now, the wisdom emerging from this research is that we all want to see ourselves as ethical people. Yet, at times, we succumb to temptation and behave unethically. These moral failures challenge our perception of ourselves, and so we engage various mental maneuvers to neutralize this threat. This could be either before or after we act, and we're often unaware of it. And this goes to show that we have moral hypocrisy, appearing moral while avoiding the cost of being so. So, let's talk about when does attitude predict behavior? Now, the question is, why do we do what we do or act the way we act? Let's start with an example. Say you don't know how to feel about the dumping of dolomite in the small portion of the Manila Bay. What exactly influences this decision? You may start reading about the effects of dolomite sand on the environment and about the sustainability of such project and form an opinion about the issue. You may talk to friends and see what they think about the said issue too. You may go to the actual dumping site and see for yourself how sustainable and how helpful the said project is in the end goal of rehabilitating Manila Bay. You may even do all of this and with everything that's available to you at some stage of, you make a stance regarding the issue. Now, a good theory that explains and predicts how such behaviors form is called the theory of planned behavior. It's built on, or rather, it's built out of a number of constructs. And we are going to look at each of these constructs here. Now, the first one is the attitude towards the act or behavior. This is our belief of a certain behavior or act makes a positive or negative contribution to our lives. In the Dolomite Sand example, it means that you either believe that spending 389 million pesos to dumping crushed dolomite sand on a small section of the Manila Bay makes sense for you or not. Now, the second construct is called subjective norm. This construct focuses on everything around the individual. In other words, his or her social network, cultural norms, group beliefs, and so on. Let's go back to our Dolomite Sand example. You will already have an opinion or former belief as to what others think about the dumping of Dolomite Sand, and that belief again influences your decisions. So, a third construct is called perceived behavioral control. And what this construct actually expresses is a person's belief on how easy or hard it is to display certain behaviors or act in a certain way. Again, in the Dolomite Sand case, you might go to the actual site and see for yourself how much sense in terms of sustainability the project has. Now, what the theory now actually predicts is that a positive attitude towards the act or behavior, Now, favorable social norms and high level of perceived behavioral control are the best predictors for forming a behavioral intention and in turn lead to a displayed behavior or act. In other words, it predicts that if you think the dumping of dolomite sand is a good idea and you believe everyone else thinks it's a good idea and you believe it's easy to express your thoughts on the internet about the issue, then you are going to post a message in support of the project. If one of those constructs is unfavorable, the likelihood of you posting your opinions online decreases. If 2 or even 3 out of these constructs are unfavorable, the likelihood of you performing the behavior further decreases. Now, to answer the question, when does attitude predict behavior? It is when social influences on what we say are minimal, when other influences on behaviors are minimal, when attitudes specific to behaviors are examined too. So let's now talk about how to make attitudes potent. So if you want people to follow through on their expressed attitude, you can do 2 things. Number 1, bring attitudes to mind. Our attitudes become potent if we think about them. So self-conscious people usually are in touch with their attitudes. So what you want to do if you want to convince someone, or if you want to or if you're expecting someone to follow through on their attitude, is to bring those attitudes to mind. You can actually do this for yourself too. For example, you posted on social media that you will be exercising more. So if you want to convince yourself to exercise more, you may want to go back to that post and remind yourself that I posted this like 2 days ago. The second way to make attitudes potent is to forge strong attitudes through experience. Attitudes are actually amplified if they are experienced. Our attitudes, let's say towards a dog, are amplified when we have been bitten by a dog in the past. So you may want to ask someone, have you ever been bitten by a dog? Or if you want someone to agree with you or to make the attitude potent, tell them or start your conversation by telling them, remember the time that you did this, that you did that? Or remember that you promised that you will do this, do that. So these are the two ways in which we can make attitudes potent. Number one, by bringing attitudes to mind. And number two, by forging strong attitudes through experience. So let's now talk about when behaviors predict attitudes. So if social psychology has taught us anything during the past 25 years, it's that we can think ourselves in a way of acting. Now, we turn to a more startling idea that behaviors can determine attitudes. So it's true that we sometimes stand for what we believe in, but it's also true that we come to believe in what we stand up for. Now, social psychological theories inspired much of the research that underlines this conclusion. Though the mental after effects of our behaviors also appear in many social psychological examples of self-persuasion. As we will see over and over, attitudes follow behavior. So, now the word role is borrowed from the theater, and as in the theater refers to actions expected of those who occupy a particular social position. When we enact new social roles, we may be at first feel phony, right? But our unease seldom lasts. Think of a time when you stepped into some new role. Perhaps your first day on a job or at college. The first week on campus, for example, you may have been super sensitive to your new social situation and tried valiantly to act mature and to suppress your high school behavior of running around the campus. At such time, you may have felt self-conscious. You observed your new speech and actions because they weren't natural to you. Then one day, something amazing happened. Your pseudo-intellectual talk no longer felt forced. The role began to fit as comfortably as your old jeans and t-shirt. In one famous study, college men volunteered to spend time in a simulated prison constructed in Stanford's psychology department by Philip Zimbardo in 1971. Zimbardo wanted to find out, is prison brutally a product of evil prisoners and malicious guards? Or do the institutional roles of guards and prisoners embitter and harden even compassionate people? Do people make the place violent, or does the place make people violent? By a flip of a coin, Zimbardo designated some students as guards. He gave them uniforms, billy clubs, and whistles and instructed them to enforce the rules. The other half, the prisoners, were locked in cells and made to wear humiliating hospital gown-like outfits. At a jovial first day of playing their roles, the guards and prisoners and even the experimenters got caught up in the situation. The guards began to disparage the prisoners, and some devised cruel and degrading routines. The prisoner broke down, rebelled, or even became apathetic. There developed, reported Zimbardo in 1972, a growing confusion between reality and illusion, between role play and self-identity. Now, this prison, which they have created, was absorbing them as creatures of their own reality, or of its own reality. Observing the emerging social pathology, Zimbardo was forced to call off the planned 2-week simulation after only 6 days. Now, the point is not that we are powerless to resist imposed rules. Rather, it concerns how what is unreal, an artificial role, can subtly morph into what is real. In a new career, as a teacher, as a soldier, a business person, for example, we enact a role that shapes our attitudes. So the second way in which behaviors predict attitude is when saying becomes believing. Okay? So people often adapt what they say to please their listeners. They are quicker to tell people good news than bad news, and they adjust their message towards their listener's position. When induced to give spoken or written support to something they doubt, people will often feel bad about their deceit. Nevertheless, they begin to believe what they are saying, provided they weren't bribed or coerced into doing so. When there is no compelling external explanation for one's word, saying becomes believing. Tory Higgins and his colleagues in 1978 and 1984 illustrated how saying becomes believing. They had university students read a personality description of someone and then summarized it for someone else, who was believed either to like or dislike the person. The students wrote a more positive descriptions when the recipient liked the person. Having said positive things, they also then liked the person more themselves. Asked to recall what they had read, they remembered the descriptions as more positive than it was. In short, people tend to adjust their message to their listeners, and having done so, to believe the altered message. And this brings us to the foot in the door phenomenon. Most of us can recall times when, after agreeing to help out with a project or an organization, we ended up more involved than we ever intended, vowing that in the future we would say no to such requests. How does this happen? Now, the foot in the door phenomena is the tendency for people to have first agreed to a small request to comply later with a larger request, as shown by this example. In keeping with the attitude follows behavior principle, experiments suggest that if you want people to do a high favor for you, an effective strategy is to get them to do a small favor first. In the best known demonstration of the foot in the door phenomenon, researchers posing as Drive Safely volunteers asked Californians to permit the installation of a huge, poorly lettered "Drive Carefully" sign in their front yard. Now, only 17% consented. Others were first approached with a small request. Would they display a 3-inch Be a Safe Driver window sign? Now, nearly all readily agreed. When approached 2 weeks later to allow the huge, ugly sign in their front yard, 76% actually consented. One project helper who went from house to house later recalled that, not knowing who had been previously visited, I was simply stunned at how easy it was to convince some people. Now, we call this the foot in the door phenomenon. And if you want to convince someone to do a big favor for you, start asking them to do small favors first. Later on, building up to bigger favors, and later on moving on to your actual favor. So the foot in the door phenomenon is very powerful in persuading other people and also in persuading ourselves. So the attitude follows behavior principle works with immoral acts as well. Evil sometimes results from gradually escalating commitment. A trifling evil act can whittle down one's moral sensitivity, making it easier to perform a worse act. After telling a white lie and thinking, well, that wasn't so bad, the person may go on to tell a bigger lie. Another way in which evil acts influence attitudes is the paradoxical fact that we tend not only to hurt those we dislike, but also to dislike those we hurt. Now, several studies in the 1960s found that harming an innocent victim by uttering hurtful comments or delivering electric shocks typically lead aggressors to disparage their victims, thus helping them justify their cruel behaviors. So when the next time that you are going to comment about another person's appearance or post a disparaging comment on Facebook, remember that when you do this, you're actually convincing yourself to dislike the person more. This is especially so when we are coaxed into, not coerced. When we agree to a deed voluntarily, we take more responsibility for it. The phenomenon appears in wartime. Prisoners of war camp guards would sometimes display good manners to captives in their first days on the job, but not for long. Soldiers ordered to kill may initially react with revulsion to the point of sickness over their act, but not for long. Before long, they will denigrate their enemies with nicknames. People tend to dehumanize their enemies and humanize their pets. Attitudes also follow behavior in peacetime. A group that holds another in slavery will likely come to perceive the slaves as having traits that justify their oppression. Prison staff who participate in execution experience moral disengagement by coming to believe more strongly than do other prison staff that their victims deserve their fate. Actions and attitudes feed each other, sometimes to the point of moral numbness. The more one harms another and adjusts one's attitude, the easier it becomes to do harm. Conscience is corroded. Harmful acts shape the self, but thankfully do moral acts. One character is reflected in what we do, or our character is reflected in what we do when we think no one is looking at us. Now, researchers have tested character by giving children temptation when it seems no one is watching. Consider what happens when children resist the temptation. In a dramatic experiment, Jonathan Friedman in 1965 introduced elementary school children to an enticing battery-controlled robot, instructing them not to play with it while he was out of the room. Now, Friedman used a severe threat with half the children and mild threat with the others. Both were sufficient to deter the children. Several weeks later, a different researcher with no apparent relationship to the other or to the earlier events left each children to play in the same room with the same toys. Of the children who had been given the severe threat, 3/4 now freely played with the robot. Of those given mild deterrent, 2/3 still persisted playing with it. Apparently, the deterrent was strong enough to elicit the desired behavior, yet mild enough to leave them with a sense of choice. Having earlier chosen consciously not to play with the toy, the mildly deterred children internalized their decisions. Moral actions, especially when chosen rather than coerced, affect moral thinking. So, the next time you want someone to behave morally, give them a choice. Don't coerce the choice on them. So, the next are social movements. We now have seen that a society's law and therefore its behavior can have a strong influence on its racial attitudes. A danger lies in its possibility of employing the same ideas for political socialization on a mass scale. For example, or rather for many Germans during the 1930s, participation in Nazi rallies, displaying the Nazi flag, and especially the public greeting Hail Hitler established a profound inconsistency between behavior and belief. Historian Richard Grunberg in 1971 reports that for those who had their doubts about Hitler, the German greeting was a powerful conditioning device. Having once decided to intone it as an outward token of conformity, many experience discomfort at the contradiction between their words and their feelings. Prevented from saying what they believe, they tried to establish the psychic equilibrium by consciously making themselves believe what they said. Now, the practice is not limited to totalitarian regimes. Political rituals, the daily flag salute by school children, singing the national anthem, or the Duterte fist sign, use public conformity to build a private belief in patriotism. I recall participating in air raid drills in my elementary school, not so far along. So after we acted repeatedly as if we were the targets of an air attack, we came to fear air attacks. Many people assume that the most potent social indoctrination comes through brainwashing, a term coined to describe what happened to American prisoners of war during the 1950s in the Korean War. Although the thought control program was not as irresistible as brainwashing suggests, the results still were disconcerting. Hundreds of prisoners cooperated with their captors. 21 chose to remain after being granted permission to return to America. And many of those who did return came home believing, although communism won't work in America, I think it's good. It's a good thing for Asia. Edgar Shane in 1956 interviewed many of the prisoners of war and reported that the captors' methods included a gradual escalation of demands. Now, the captors always start with trivial requests and gradually work up to the more significant ones. Thus, after a prisoner had once been trained to speak or write out trivia, statements on more important issues were demanded. Moreover, they always expected active participation. Be it just copying something or participating in group discussions, writing self-criticism, or uttering public confessions. Once a prisoner had spoken or written a statement, he felt an inner need to make his beliefs consistent with his act. That often drove prisoners to persuade themselves of what they had done wrong. Now, the start small and build tactic was an effective application of the foot in the door technique. And it continues to be so in socialization of terrorists and torturers. So, now the final question we will answer in this lesson is why behaviors affect attitude. And to do so, I want you to look at the meme that I have prepared for you. So, self-presentation theory assumes that for strategic reason, we express attitudes that make us appear consistent. For example, here, self-presentation or impression management is like saying, I look like a cool smoker. Now, cognitive dissonance theory, on the other hand, assumes that to reduce discomfort, we justify our actions to ourselves. So self-justification or cognitive dissonance happen when we say, I know smoking is bad for me, but after a stressful day, I deserve this. All right? And then self-perception theory assumes that our actions are self-serving. So, for example, we observe ourselves and we say, here I am smoking again, I must like smoking. So, why do behaviors affect attitude? Because we want to present ourselves properly. Like, say that I look like a cool smoker. And then, why do we keep on doing the behavior? It's because of cognitive dissonance. We know that something is bad for us, but we keep on doing it, and then we justify our actions to ourselves, like here. And we keep on coming back because of self-perception theory, which assumes that our actions are self-serving, and then what we do is we tell ourselves, here I am again, smoking. I must like smoking a lot. So that's why rather behaviors affect attitudes. So, in conclusion, we have seen that several streams of evidence merge to form a river. The effect of actions on attitudes. Do these observations contain any clues as to why actions affect attitudes? Well, social psychologists suspect three possible sources. As we have mentioned earlier, self-presentation theory assumes that for strategic reasons, we express attitudes that make us appear consistent. It assumes that people, especially those who self-monitor their behaviors, hoping to create good impression, will adapt their attitudes to appear consistent with their actions. Now, the available evidence confirm that people do adjust their attitude statements out of concern for what other people will think about them. But it also shows that some genuine attitude change occurs. Now, cognitive dissonance theory assumes that to reduce discomfort, we justify our actions ourselves. It explains that this attitude change by assuming that we feel tension after acting contrary to our attitudes or making difficult decisions. To reduce arousal, we internally justify our behaviors. Dissonance theory further proposes that the less external justification we have for our undesirable actions, the more we feel responsible for them. And thus, more dissonance arises and more attitude change happens. Now, self-perception theory assumes that our actions are self-serving. When uncertain about our feelings or beliefs, we look to our behaviors much as anyone else does. So, this assumes that when our attitudes are weak, we simply observe our behaviors and its circumstances, then infer our attitudes. One interesting implication of self-perception theory is the over-justification effect. Rewarding people to do what they like doing anyway can turn their pleasure into drudgery if the reward leads them to attribute their behaviors to the reward. Now, this video's attitude follows behavior principle offers a powerful lesson for life. If we want to change ourselves in some important way, it's best not to wait for insight or inspiration or motivation. Sometimes we need to act, to begin to write that paper, to make those phone calls, to see that person, even if we don't feel like acting. The attitude follows behavior phenomenon is not irrational or magical. That which prompts us to that which prompts us to act may also prompt us to think. Writing an essay or role-playing an imposing view or an opposing view forces us to consider arguments we otherwise might have ignored. Also, we remember information best after explaining it in our own terms. So, this has been Dex Kamitan. Thank you for watching.